a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, listeners. We want to share an upcoming writing retreat opportunity being hosted by our good friend Annie Tucker, by writers for writers. Understory is a new writers conference located in beautiful Park City, Utah, that explores and celebrates the art and craft of storytelling. From July 24th to July 27th of this summer, 100 authors will have the chance to take more than 30 fiction and nonfiction workshops taught by renowned instructors. Writers at all stages of their process, from initial concept to complete draft, are welcome. Understory is craft-based, intimate, and focused on spending as much time outdoors as possible. So from now until April 20th, take advantage of Understory's early bird pricing, which includes a free 30-minute one-on-one editorial consultation with founder Annie Tucker. And I can speak for her that she is an amazing editor and an amazing coach, so don't miss this opportunity. We'll be focusing on questions, concerns, or brilliant ideas you have about your writing. For more information, visit understoryparkcity.com. We will both be there, Grant and I, this summer, and we'd love to see you or meet you there. Hello, story holders, story hunters, and story publishers. I am Brooke Warner, here as always with my co-host Grant Faulkner. And Grant, we're talking about writing what you know today. Also a little bit about industry insiders turned authors, because today's guest, Betsy Lerner, is a well-known agent who's been in the business for a long time. And she's not the first industry writer we've interviewed, so I thought we'd start here, just recapping a tad on those previous guests. And then I want to talk a bit about why, especially in fiction, we write what we know.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating to look back on past guests, because I'd forgotten how many of them have some sort of publishing world connection. So I'm just going to mention a few. I can't mention them all, but Brooke, you interviewed Tayari Jones for Women Lit, and Tayari's amazing novel is called An American Marriage. And early in her career, she worked as an editor, and later she taught writing. And then Zakiya Dalila Harris is a former editor at Knopf, and she wrote the book The Other Black Girl, which became a bestseller. And her book took a very critical look at the publishing industry and was billed both as a thriller and as a satire. And I remember how much you liked her unique take on the book industry, Brooke, and very cool that this one went on to become a Hulu series. We should start keeping track of that with our guests. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's Abigail Thomas, who began her career in publishing as an editor for Viking Penguin before turning to writing in her 40s. And we had her on the show a while back, and she's known for her kind of fragmented writing style and her mini memoirs, including Safekeeping, A Three-Dog Life, and What Comes Next, and How to Like It. And she also wrote the craft book Thinking About Memoir, which I've got to read. And of course, those are just the ones that come to mind, or who I found, in searching through everybody who we've interviewed, Brooke. And we have Betsy Lerner on the show today, and her debut novel is called Shred Sisters, which we'll get to. But I'm curious, what other former industry insiders turned writers did you want to give a shout out to?
There are a lot of them, as you said, but I'm going to name two whose work I love. Famously, there's Toni Morrison, beloved by hundreds of thousands. She said, I could not find the books I wanted to read, so I wrote them. That's one of her famous quotes. Before becoming a Nobel Prize winning novelist, Toni Morrison was a groundbreaking editor at Random House, and she is known for having championed and published major Black voices, including Angela Davis, Gail Jones, and Muhammad Ali. And her story is well known because it's been written about so much. You know, how she wrote in the nooks and crannies when she was a single young mom, writing fiction while she worked full time. Her first novel was The Bluest Eye. It came out in 1970, and that was published during her tenure at Random House. And so Morrison's insider knowledge of publishing really shaped her career, but it was also the reason that she was able to carve out space within Random House for these Black voices, which is super inspiring. And then I also want to mention Sloane Crosley, because I just saw her recently in New York. She was the host of the Poets and Writers Gala that I attended. She is very hilarious, and she's written very many funny best-selling books, including I Was Told There'd Be Cake. And she worked at at Vintage Anchor as a publicist, actually, before becoming an author. So there's lots of us, lots of us industry insiders that turn to trying to write books sometimes. And the reason that I wanted to talk about all of this, you mentioned, Shred Sisters is Betsy Lerner's new novel. And she has written other books prior to this one, but this is her first novel. And it does, read auto-fictional at certain points. So we're going to get into that, which parts are true and which parts aren't, because the overlap between Betsy and her main character were many. She surprised me by letting me know she's actually both sisters, which totally makes sense. But her protagonist, has a similar upbringing. She gets a job in book publishing. She rises in that space. I thought that Betsy had a sister with bipolar, but Betsy discloses to us that she's the one who has bipolar. And so that's really fascinating, to think about how we put ourselves into multiples of our characters. And I love that. Grace Paley once said, "You write from what you know, but you write into what you don't yet understand." Fiction is a profound way to enter into this inquiry, Grant. And I wonder what your thoughts are about this obsession that we have to want to speculate, what might or might not be true. I'm guilty of it, of course, when it comes to fiction writers. What do you think, and have people, subjected you to this?
Well, Brooke, I think, as human beings, we're storytellers, of course. That's who we are as people and humans. We're also gossipers,
Mm-hmm.
And so gossip is sort of a subgenre, I think, of storytelling. And I love gossip. But I have very mixed feelings about reading in this way, to tell you the truth. I've sometimes been disappointed when readers have read my work as if they're decoding my life and making assumptions about what I've experienced or who I am, or, who the characters are in my stories, who they're based on. And it's a totally natural way to read, though. And I certainly often read that way. But I also try to respond or respect the book's intention. If it's fiction, I try to read it as fiction. And that's not to say that it's not valid to ask an author to what degree they leverage their life to write the story. I agree with you that it's a completely valid and important process question. But I think we need to read works of fiction as works of art and not necessarily as direct representations of an author's life. But that said, some novels like Betsy's, invite the question, because if you've, been an editorial assistant in a publishing house and your main character is an editorial assistant in a publishing house, you've essentially told your reader that your life is somehow directly related to the story. But Brooke, I thought I'd circle back here for a moment to ask you about people who, work inside the industry and what it must be like to help others to craft their stories for years and years, perhaps knowing all the while that you have a story you want to tell and probably get published, and you're so close to it all, as an editor, agent, publisher, you midwife hundreds and sometimes thousands of stories. So I'm curious, Brooke, if you think that many or most people who get into publishing are writers or closeted writers or have ambitions to write and publish?
I mean, I don't think it's true across the board, but I do think it's more likely to be true among editors and agents. And I say this because there are so many publishing execs, right, who just get into publishing for the business side of things. But for the people who get into it for the love of books and reading, I do think, it would be really easy to think to yourself, I have a story to tell. I've done so many of these. And as an editor in particular, you end up writing a lot of those stories. Certain editors really get in there and rewrite sentences, and you can start to feel into it and be like, maybe this wouldn't be so hard. Or maybe you feel like Toni Morrison and you think to yourself, there's a book I want to read and I can write it. So I think that there are a lot of people who end up in publishing because they want proximity to books and authors. Some of them are probably shadow artists, those people who really desire to be authors, but struggle to make that dream a reality. And so they end up, in proximity instead of the one. For me, the biggest thing about proximity to the industry has historically been that it's actually quite hard to write after you've been working in words all day, week after week. But also you read enough books and you start to consider what would be the story you would tell if you could, or maybe you're just struck with inspiration or the timing happens. It could just have to do with aging or, as Betsy said, the pandemic. There's lots of things that might spur you to suddenly decide that you have a story of your own that you're ready to tell. And it makes you a better writer, obviously, to be a reader and an editor. One of my biggest pet peeves with writers, Grant, I know I've said this on the show before, is writers who confess to not reading, or not reading in their genre. People do tell me that a fair amount. And I'm like, curious. So at least if you're an industry insider, you know that they are good readers.
Yeah, let's hope so. I'm still, likewise, I'm very appalled to hear that. But fortunately, I don't hear it too often about writers. But it's out there. You're right. I actually once read a survey of agents, and I can't remember the specifics, but it was something like 80 or 90% of them wanted to be a writer, or they intended to be a writer to start, or something like that. If they couldn't agent, they would be a writer. I think that's what they said. And my agent has her MFA, so she's a writer. But you're right, it's definitely a tough profession to be involved with, and in words all day and screens, and not to mention being behind the scenes of the sausage factory where all the sausage, the books are being made. I always thought my best job to be a writer was when I was a waiter, because I could work nights and I met all kinds of dramatic and sometimes insane people. And as a result of all the kind of bustle of the job, I cherished my quiet time to read and write in solitude. But, let's go back to your question and talk more about Betsy Lerner's book. Tell us more about it, Brooke.
Yeah, Shred Sisters. I did read it and feel that it was the story of her heart. The book is about two sisters, Amy and Olivia. Amy is the younger one. Olivia is the older one. As the story goes on, Olivia's mental illness really becomes center stage. And the book is about how the entire family reacts, buckles, fractures in so many ways because of this very volatile person within the family unit. Like I said, I read this and thought that Betsy had a sibling with bipolar. So it's interesting, that what she shares with us when she gets to the interview is I appreciate so much that she tells us like a lot of that is based on her own experience. And so you have to imagine, like whether you're the person experiencing the impact of the mania, or if you're the person giving the experience of those ups and downs, until you find the right medication and level out. There's a lot of ups and downs. I've read many, many memoirs and worked with a lot of people in this space. And so I do also understand it pretty intimately. Personal experience is so often the foundation for fiction. Sometimes people say debut fiction is always autofictional because novelists write what they know and we're encouraged to write what we know. But Grant, tell us more about this axiom. Why are writers told to write what they know?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure if I know the answer to the why. I actually think that it's one of the most problematic bits of writing advice, personally, and from all my talks with especially young writers, and I definitely struggled with it. Like, I think write what you know is best seen as a type of Zen koan. And I say that because it's not meant to be taken literally. For example, I've never been to the Everglades, but I can write a novel about a bartender in the Everglades, or a librarian, or a space alien, because what I know is something about life and human messiness and desire and longing and conflict and a bunch of other stuff. So I think it's more about an attitude and actually knowing yourself and taking stock of what you know when you write, and then using that. But beyond that, we're obviously living in this interesting era where memoirs are leaning into more fictionality, as we discussed with Lydia Yuknovich recently. And a huge trend in novels is autofiction, which doesn't really have a hard and fast rule to determine what it is, other than an author taking very directly and intentionally from their lives to shape their novel. I was thinking maybe we need a measurement, like 80% from real life makes it autofiction, because when I read autofiction, or fiction that seems like autofiction to me, sometimes I'm just making that assumption. I have no idea what's fiction and what's reality, and I tend to wonder why it's not just memoir. So, Brooke, this brings up a question. How do you feel when you read a novel that feels so true to you, when you think to yourself, this must be the author's story? Do you ever just think, why isn't this a memoir?
Sometimes, admittedly, I do think that for sure. I mean, one of the things I really appreciate about today's interview with Betsy is that she talks about, like, she draws from her life and she infuses both characters with different aspects of herself. And then so much of the story itself is not true. I think this whole thing I was talking about earlier, the propensity to speculate is maybe the problem of the reader, right? Because some books need to be fictionalized because they're holding a particular kind of story, and fiction is a form that writers get to choose from. And yeah, if you're really like making up whole scenes or just trying to be, true to the elements of your experience, but really want to make up the plot, then it totally needs to be fiction, right? And we were just talking about this recently when we had the conversation about All Fours by Miranda July. It's not a memoir. But there are many aspects that are true, and therefore people are calling it autofiction. She's calling it autofiction. I guess the same is true, but even less so, it sounds like, for Shred Sisters. Like, it did read like autofiction to me until she started talking about it. And then I realized, yeah, no, this absolutely 100% is a novel. And sometimes I think writers do struggle. I have known a lot of writers over the years whose story is so true, they want to fictionalize it. They grapple with whether they should. But I think your idea of 80% qualifying as autofiction is a really interesting one. And then the measure for a memoir should be, did it happen? Mm-hmm. Because if you're really completely creating scenes out of whole cloth, then that can't be a memoir, right? So it's interesting, but we keep talking about how the lines are blurring, that readers maybe care less and less, and artists don't really want to be confined per se. So I'm curious if I guess it's a rhetorical question because I know you agree with me. We've talked about it before.
Yeah, but I do have something to add. I definitely agree. And I recently talked with a writer at the AWP conference, and she had gotten one of the early MFA degrees in hybrid writing. I forget when this was. It might have been the 90s or the early 2000s or something. But what we were talking about is how the notion of hybrid writing has become much more mainstream. And even though not many MFA programs offer like a degree or a specialty in that, as we talked, I realized just how many books these days have a hybrid quality. They combine real world events with real world lives, and that's alongside fiction or philosophy or photos or art. And I love this trend because I view myself mostly as a collagist these days, so I like to kind of rip things out and paste them in other contexts. And I think that's what is happening with a lot of writing to different degrees. So I can't wait to talk more about this with Betsy after this super short break.
Welcome back, everyone. We're delighted to have Betsy Lerner with us today. Betsy is the author of the popular advice book to writers, The Forest for the Trees, and the memoirs Food and Loathing and The Bridge Ladies. She is the co-writer with Temple Grandin on the New York Times bestseller Visual Thinking. Betsy also received an MFA from Columbia University in poetry. She's been a publishing professional for more than 30 years. Shred Sisters is Betsy's first novel. So Betsy, hello, welcome, and congratulations on this new book.
Hi, thank you.
You're an industry insider turned author. I mean, of course, you have other books before now, but this is your debut fiction. And so I imagine a lot of interviewers ask you this question, but tell us how long you had this book brewing in you, and did being both an editor and agent over all of these years make it more or less difficult to write a novel and get it published?
I never dreamed of writing a novel or becoming a novelist. My real dream in life was to become a screenwriter, to be honest, and poetry took over a huge part of my life. And then I've been a nonfiction girly, editing and representing nonfiction. So this was actually the last thing from my mind. But it did happen during COVID, and a lot of things were building up inside of me, I think. And I think Dr. Freud would have a field day with me because it is my entire life kind of landed in this book, all the writing that I've ever done, everything I've ever thought about fiction and structure and characters and plot. All the blogging I've done, all the screenplays I've written that are not produced, it just all sort of finally landed in this novel, which came out of me in 7 months.
Did you thank the pandemic in your acknowledgments, Betsy?
Yeah, I should.
That's quite a story. Well, Shred Sisters centers around two sisters in a family that's impacted by mental illness, and you showcase the fallout and the splintering that results from a person's actions and behaviors when they're in the throes of a manic episode, and the whole roller coaster of being in proximity to all this, as portrayed by Amy, the younger sister, grappling with her sister's bipolar diagnosis. And bipolar or all mental health issues are still so stigmatized. And I'm curious about your approach to writing into this topic and just what considerations you had around your own family, presuming there's some personal connection in your own life to this specific mental health issue.
Yes, presumption correct. I was diagnosed with bipolar illness when I was 15, and I refused to stay on medications for 15 years. Did a lot of cycling, a lot of depression. Ollie's hypomanic in the book, so she's on one end of that spectrum. I'm bipolar type 1. I cycle very regularly through the seasons, but I finally got the right doctor and right medication when I was 30 and had my child. So I've been stable for 35 years, and I'm deeply grateful. I think I have to thank the book for that. I could not have written a coming of age in my 20s. I was far too disorganized and going through too much. So I've written this book with really completely from the inside out. When I was diagnosed, my family was tremendously stigmatized. They were very ashamed. They took me to a psychiatrist. They basically hijacked me and took me to a psychiatrist the way they do with Ollie in the book. There are a lot of resemblances and obviously a lot highly fictionalized, but I think I've read everything from the confessional poets, Kate Jameson on mental illness, to the neurologists. It's one of the subjects of my life, figuring out myself and working with a lot of creative people with bipolar illness. It's just sort of let's call it a subspecialty.
That's really interesting to hear you say that, because of course, Amy is your first person protagonist. Ollie is the sister in your book. And so, everyone does this thing of speculating, which is the true part. And of course you're both, right? I mean, you show up in both sisters, because it's Amy who is in the book publishing industry and who has this career, as an editor. And so I was just curious about how you make those decisions. You said like a lot of it is totally fictionalized, but it's so close to truth. I mean, was the story itself drawn from your own experience with your family and your sisters? How do you even start to piece something like this together when so much of it is true?
Yeah, I was listening to one of your podcasts about autofiction, and I've thought about that quite a lot because I also represent and have worked on many memoirs. I love confessional writing. I love personal writing. I don't think I could have written a book in the third person. I don't have the craft, and the first person comes very naturally to me. I've kept diaries my whole life. I blogged for a decade. I now do TikTok. I'm first person all the way. And Amy's voice just was completely natural to me. I'm also an Amy. Once I got my shit together, very dutiful. I don't light up the room. I'm the observer and the bystander. And I went to New York, much like Amy, to disappear and be anonymous and, hide that way, not to, I'll make it anywhere. That was not my New York journey at all. How did I differentiate it? Well, I really did make up the story. My parents didn't split up. I'm one of 3 sisters. I didn't divorce young. There's a lot that is highly fictionalized, but there's so much that I did draw from my life. And even the smallest details, I fixate on things. Like I will have strong memories from 30 years ago of just one humiliating moment, and I will draw on that for the book, and it was just an incredible process. I didn't even realize how much of it was autobiographical until afterwards, or so my sisters said, that scene, the opening scene where she smashes into the glass, I thought was completely made up. And then my sister reminded me that I had once slammed the door on her and a full-length mirror came down and it woke my dad up and he was furious with us. So much of it came out of my subconscious. So I wasn't making decisions, really. I was just writing, and it all came through.
Well, Betsy, before you came on, Brooke and I were talking a little bit about agents who, really want to be writers, essentially. And you've been doing this a long time. And before becoming an agent, you were an editor for a number of years. And now with your novel, you're obviously on the other side of the experience of getting a book into the world. So I'm curious, how did you decide, who should represent you? And how did you work agent to writer, and how did you decide what publisher to go with, knowing everything you know?
Yeah, it's sort of like a doctor operating on himself. It's hard to know too much because, as an editor, former editor and agent, we know when a book is going to tank, well before it's even out. Usually I know how to read all of the tea leaves. So that's really hard. And I've had 3 different agents. So what does that tell you? I don't know. I needed different things at different times. I mean, I was fortunate that I knew enough people that I could choose who to talk to and have conversations with and see who fit. With the publishers too, in the past, I did have some choice, but with this book, I'll be honest, I got a lot of rejections. One person really saw it and actually really helped me revise it to the book that it is now. I got tremendous editorial support and just feel very lucky. I do have a lot of advantages because I've learned so much about marketing and publicity and how to build an audience. And I've been doing that for 40 years. And I spend a great deal of my agenting time coaching my authors how to use social media, how to work with bookstores, how to connect with organizations. I'm a very elbow grease person. I think, you can just do so much just writing note cards. I'm a huge note card person. So yeah, I put everything I've learned about publishing into this book because I thought, why the hell not? I'm in my mid-60s. I've got nothing to lose or prove at this point, so it was just the most fun thing for me to throw everything at.
It was fun to read being in the industry. And I think I told you when we were connecting online that I went to the Kauai Writers Conference and people there, other agents were reading your book and we were talking about it. So I was thinking about all these industry people reading this novel. Before you wrote this novel, I mean, you have 2 memoirs. You also wrote this well-loved craft book called The Forest for the Trees. And in that book, you categorize writers into archetypes, so the ambivalent writer, the natural, the neurotic. I wonder if you are, self-analyze enough to share with us what kind of writer you are, and if you have a better or different understanding of that now that you've written the novel.
Right. Yes. I think I'm probably all of them in some way. The chapter Touching Fire is obviously the one about people who struggle with mental illness and their creative lives. So that chapter meant a lot to me. I've had 4 authors take their lives, and I've lived through that over 4 decades. It's part of why I don't take on memoirs anymore. I've sort of moved on to more general nonfiction. I'm fascinated by the interior life of writers and psychology of creative people. So that chapter means the most to me in that book. But the ambivalent writer, the first chapter, I mean, here I was somebody who's been writing pretty much every day of my life, but went into publishing and sublimated all of my writing desires. They kept bubbling up from every time I did publish a book. But for all the 4 books I've published, I have notebooks and screenplays and letters and half-finished notebooks. There's been as much rejection or not being able to finish things as there have been the projects I've finished, which I think is true for most writers. But I never put my whole self into it. I really loved being in the world. I needed a job. I needed structure. I needed people to need me. All of those things publishing gave me, as well as this amazing education and how to put books together and support writers.
So Betsy, it's so fascinating to hear you talk about publishing, and I know you give a lot of talks and workshops about book publishing, and so we want to ask you a publishing question. And this is one I've heard from my own agent and from other agents and writers about, whether it's harder to get published now. We hear that from agents that they're just not getting the looks or requests that they got in the past, and so is your experience the same, or is it just about representing the books that are trending?
It's really difficult. And I would say that the younger agents in my office talk all the time about being ghosted. Ghosting is the new no. Mm-hmm. The ghosting is and I do blame COVID on that. I mean, people just are not as connected or on the grid, in the way. There's a ton of ghosting. There's a ton of competition, so many more agents. I think editors are getting sometimes 30 or 40 projects a week. When I was an editor, I got 8 or 9, and I thought that was a lot to cope with. Oh, what else? It's just a tough environment. Publishers really want the authors to have very well-developed platforms before they take them on now. It used to be if you had 1 story or 3 stories in some good magazines, you could sell a story collection. I think those days are over. Platform. It's really, that's why I got on Book Talk, because, people used to say only this moved the needle. And now it's only Book Talk moves the needle. So I thought, well, I better see what this is all about. And that's why I've gone on this whole TikTok journey, because I actually found I loved the community there. But Yeah, it's definitely more difficult. And I put my authors through many more paces now. A writer called me yesterday, to a Time magazine journalist, to run an idea by me. And I would have always said, it's your passion, pursue it, of course. And instead I heard myself saying, well, what about this? What about that? What's your framework? Who's your audience? And just being so much more analytical about it. I've done everything until now by intuition and by feel and by passion. But now I feel I need to put on a marketing hat and a publicity hat and really think it all the way through before I take something on.
That segues really nicely actually into our final question here. And I appreciate you talking about book talk. And it seems like you're pretty savvy about marketing and publicity, or at least willing to lean into it, right? Because I think a lot of people are like, I just don't want to do that, or it's too hard. And so what have you learned about just the experience of promoting and being on the other side of specifically a published novel? Because I think memoir and your craft book, those are different kinds of experiences. But a lot of times when I hear from authors who are writing fiction, they're very frustrated because they're like, how do you build a platform? How do you do the publicity? So what insights do you have for people who are in the world of fiction?
Do you mean like literally what I did? Or
that would be great if you have one thing that you want to share specifically, or, don't fret it. You actually can build a platform or, a post publication, I guess, interest for your book.
Well, the first thing I did is I made 500 note cards with the jacket of my book. And I sent notes to every bookseller I've ever met, every local library. 10 years ago when I did my Bridge Lady tour, I kept every single contact. I wrote notes to everybody saying how much I loved meeting them 10 years ago, and they wanted to know what I was doing now. Better late than never. Could we do an event? Could we do something? And now that there's Zoom, you don't have to travel and spend that time and money, et cetera. So the Zoom option just made it possible for me to do a ton of book clubs and long distance events, so that I really am a big believer in note cards. So few people send them. They're meaningful to people. And with the jacket of your book, it's just another little reminder, hey, I'm here. I did spend the time getting to know the book talk influencers, the people who love literary fiction and what I call sad girl literary fiction, which is sort of my lane on book talk. I do also post on Facebook. I somehow missed the Instagram train, but growing those markets are good. Substack's amazing for discovery. Also, because I have a workshops that I can offer, I also write to festivals and MFA programs, and anywhere where I think people might be interested in what I do. And I think fiction writers have a lot to offer. Also, if your novel is about something in particular, the way mine is about mental illness, I've also gone on a bunch of podcasts about mental health. I've written to some psychological societies to see if they ever need a keynote or a piece for their newsletters. I mean, there's just with your internet, you can research so many ways to find the people who would be naturally interested in your book. And then I personalize all of my letters. I research them a little bit. I figure out what they like. Yeah, it's elbow grease. And I tell people too, if you have an advance and you have a little extra money, hire an intern or hire an assistant who can just give you 3-4 hours a week to help you do all this research to find the right people. My marketing has been very successful, but it's because I put in the time reading about what the people do, pitching them where they are, pitching them something I think they would like. It takes a lot of time. I have a young woman who works with me 4 hours a week, and she's just does the spreadsheets and does the follow-up for me, or even sometimes preliminary research. I like to do that stuff myself, but I tell all my authors, hire somebody. It's lonely and it's hard work, and having a team is just so helpful to make it happen.
Thank you for all that specificity. So I think that will be super helpful to our listeners. So Betsy, thank you so much, and congrats again.
Oh, thank you. So great to meet you guys. I love your podcast, and I feel like, where have you been all my life?
Oh, thank you. That's so kind.
We'll be right back with this week's Substacking.
You know, Grant, one of the thoughts I always have about industry insiders turned authors is that they know the ropes. You know, they have relationships both with other agents and inside publishing houses. You might believe that it's easier for them to get published than it would be for other writers. And I don't think that's an unfair assessment, because you get your foot in the door in this industry. If you know people, you know the lingo, you understand how to navigate the ups and downs, the ins and outs. So for today's Substack-in, I wanted to remind listeners about a great Substack resource out there called Subclub. I did a guest post for them a while back, and I've been very impressed by their offerings, all of which are in support of writers submitting their work. And so this really just felt like the right tie-in for today.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I looked at their homepage today, and their homepage, by the way, is subclub.substack.com. You could just do a search on Subclub probably, but you know, they've got a bunch of writers and a lot of great information about, you know, who's taking what kind of submissions, and they also have, you know, various newsletters like where to submit this week, or where to query this week, where to pitch this week, or even jobs for writers, and it's just such an incredible resource, really. And I definitely wish I would have had something like this when I was a young aspiring writer. When I first started writing, I had to buy this huge ass book that had like,
I mean,
it was like 5 Sears catalogs in one, if you remember Sears catalogs, and it had like every lit mag and publisher in the universe, and it weighed like 20 pounds. And I was lucky enough to buy it on my spring break trip to San Francisco when I was a senior in college in 1987. And otherwise, I don't think such a thing really existed in Iowa. I suppose I would have had to go to a library or something. I think Writer's Digest used to publish those things every year too. And you know, like when I think about it, publishing is such a mystery now, but it was a huge mystery back then, and it took a lot of legwork. And as for getting a job as a writer or in writing, I think you just had to take the bus to New York City and hope for the best.
It's so funny. We were just talking about that the other day, Grant, when we were reminiscing about The Sun and how old school their submissions process was, like forever, and how long it took them to pivot to being online. I totally understand that impulse to want to hold the line as someone who receives submissions, because you and I both interface with them, you know, as guests for this show, you for 100 Word Story, me for Publishing with She Writes Press. It's both heartening and troubling for writers to know what a shit show it is, truly. It's heartening, right? Because it's not really an indication of your work if you don't hear back. But it's troubling because the volume of submissions means that your emails are going unanswered. And Betsy is going to speak to this, or did speak to this, excuse me, in the interview when she was talking about ghosting. You know, like, I want to get back to everyone who emails me, but I literally can't, which is why we put the publishing side up on Submittable. You know, the volume was crushing the staff, and we couldn't even keep up. And that's just She Writes, right? And so imagine agents. I cannot, you know, like they are just getting so many inquiries. And so I think you got to hustle, but you also have to realize, like, you probably are going to need to be a nag. Like, if you only email once and then you just let it go, it's very likely that you're missing an opportunity to connect.
Totally. And it's interesting because the systems we set up to handle submissions also increase submissions, you know? Like, I used to have to Xerox 10 copies of a story and the cover letter, and then put all of that in an envelope along with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and then go to the post office to mail them. All that took like maybe a couple hours to send out submissions. So it kept the volume down, actually. And I'm personally, as an author, deeply thankful for online submissions, except that volume, like you mentioned, it definitely can be smothering. And I recently talked to my agent, and she's been saying this for at least a couple of years. Just what Betsy said, that ghosting is now the new norm from editors and many agents, for that matter. And I know that one of the big 5 publishers, I can't remember which one, but the head of it sent out an email to agents apologizing for his editors ghosting them. And that was kind of at the tail end of the pandemic, but I think it still happens. So you just assume you're rejected if you don't hear back after several queries. But I think you're right. You got to send those queries and keep asking the question.
You have to ask at least 3 times. You know, I think if you send once and you just are like, oh, never mind, that you're really doing yourself a disservice, and it's appropriate to show back up in their inbox and say, hey, this is my second time. You know, be very kind about it. But then, like, if someone says, oh, I emailed you before, or this is my second or my third inquiry, I'm much more likely to get back to them. I hate to say that. I mean, I actually feel terrible about it, but I really do understand, because we also have jobs to do. And where submitting is concerned, yeah, I mean, set real realistic goals. I really like the idea of really trying to submit something. And I'm talking about stories or essays, twice or 3 times a year, because submitting can become a full-time job and there's so much to learn. Oh my gosh. And these industry insiders, like I said, they have a bit of a leg up because of this inside track, and they understand what agents and editors and gatekeepers are looking for. They know how to interact with people like that. But this is stuff you can learn, and places like Sub Club are giving really great advice and just insights. So subscribe, check it out. It'll help you navigate this wild landscape as well. And there's all kinds of stuff. I hope that we're doing that too. We're trying to give inspiration, advice, best practices, all the things. So we super appreciate you being here. I was very moved by Betsy's super precise and specific instruction today. Such good, really, again, best practices for how to get yourself out there with all of the noise. There's just so much more volume out there. So stay with it, stay true to yourself, write what you know. Have a great week. Write on. We'll see you next time.